skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and in love. Good morning, sun. Good morning, sun.
And good morning. Off to a late start. What is today? Is today Monday? Yes, okay. Today's Monday. That would explain things. So, today I would like to talk about the newly announced Business Central certification exam and then talk about the entire concept of learning Business Central and just kind of share my journey and my thoughts and what I'm working on and ramble about that. So, with that, just make sure everything is working okay. Okay, so the usual note that although this is streaming on Periscope, if you want the higher resolution version, check out YouTube or Twitch. So let's proceed. So you may have seen that last week an announcement was made about a new Business Central functional exam, a certification exam to be offered by Microsoft in October 2020. And Alexander Todovic announced this on Twitter, and there were a few other people who saw that and retweeted it or blogged about it. And it looks good. It is a apparently new Business Central functional, so application functionality exam. And I don't know where they're going with the exams, and we don't yet know everything that this one exam will include. No curriculum has been announced, no learning plan or learning curriculum has been listed for what you would want to study. Hopefully they have Microsoft Learn courses that will be available online to help produce a curriculum to study for this exam, but we'll see. Apparently it's in beta testing now, and then we'll see what it looks like up to the October release and whether we can, how we study for it. So I think that's great news, shows investment in Business Central as one of the key Dynamics 365 ERP products. And it's good to see that investment as someone who's coming from the GP world. You GP folks know what I'm talking about. And we'll see what learning comes into play, how much you need to know to pass this. Is it going to be brutally hard, incredibly broad across the entire product? Because one exam, it could cover a lot of territory. So we'll see how that plays out. And here's the URL for that. It's called the MB-800 exam, currently listed as beta, Business Central Functional Consultant. And I didn't really think about that previously. Functional consultant. So is that more partner-oriented, consultant-oriented? What if you're an end user? Not quite sure. So like I mentioned, no learning paths or curriculum are published as of July 2020, but interesting. So it's good news. But that leads me to the broader topic of how I'm learning for Business Central, how I've been learning over the last year or two, I guess. 2018, somewhere in 2018 is when I started trying to focus on Business Central, and already 2020, and I'm still very much a novice. I've not been able to spend as much time as I wanted. So there was this kind of, I didn't know what I didn't know, so I was a little bit naive. I thought, okay, I want to learn Business Central, and I also want to learn Business Central development. Kind of like now I know how to work with Dynamics GP, and I know how to do Dynamics GP development. So that is great, but a little bit naive, admittedly, because I didn't know quite what I was getting into. So I thought, great, I need to learn how to use this new Business Central SaaS application. And back when I started I don't even think the name Business Central was assigned. I forget, Tenerife and whatever other temporary names were used initially. Now it's Business Central, and I thought I need to learn the application, just like I knew Dynamics GP, I knew how to enter transactions, I understood how things worked. I need to have that same knowledge in general for Business Central. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, right? Then I need to learn the programming language, and that's AL. Okay, so I need to learn this AL, and I'm thinking syntax, right? So you have variable declaration, you have loops, how do you access the database and objects and stuff like that. Okay, makes sense. I understand the scope of what I think I need to learn. Great. And you'll see a matrix theme here. This is Neo sitting in his cubicle, kind of oblivious to the matrix and the world he's living. He checks in, does his work, goes home, and does his thing. But then I kind of started to learn more about what I needed to learn. And this is more what I think I actually need to learn. It's a little bit more than what I thought, right? Because you can't just learn AL without having all of the context around that with which you can use the AL language. And so, okay, let's just start with that side. Well, in order to do AL development, kind of the easier path, you could, I guess, purchase a Business Central production tenant and try developing against that and the sandboxes you create. But I don't know that that's viable. I honestly don't know. There may be some limitations, technical limitations that you really can't do that, and you do need the local sandboxes. So, and all of this is in the context of Business Central SaaS. Nav and on-prem BC, totally different ballgame. There may be similarities, but I'm not even going to go there. My focus is purely on BC SaaS. So there was this thing called Docker, right? You can use a Docker container to do development. You don't have to have an online sandbox or a full Azure VM. You can use Docker to run full Business Central sandbox on your desktop, laptop, server, whatever in your local environment. It's free effectively, and you can grab the latest code, the latest build, prior releases. Awesome. Well, in order to do that, you kind of at least need to have a minimal understanding of Docker. You need to install it. You need to fight with it. You need to get it working and figure out how do you deal with this thing called Docker. You need to wrap your head around what is Docker, and that is intimidating and challenging for many people. So then, as I'm learning, as you may have seen recently, well, when you work with Docker, that typically is done through PowerShell. Okay, so you need to kind of know PowerShell. You don't need to be an expert, but there's this thing called Nav Container Helper, and you run that through PowerShell. Well, you can do all this stuff manually and fight with the command line, but if you're looking to kind of automate some of these tasks, automate housekeeping, understand what's going on, and not have to manually deal with everything, well, PowerShell becomes this other thing you might want to learn and automate things, script things, schedule things, whatever. And if you're in an organization, that doesn't necessarily mean you personally, right? Maybe you have a person who can deal with Docker, deal with PowerShell, deal with Nav Container Helper, and you are just the person who works in VS Code and AL, and those Docker containers are handed to you on a platter. Fantastic. But someone's going to need to understand this and manage it, whether it's you or someone in your organization or whoever helps you with that role. So Docker, PowerShell, Nav Container Helper. Nav Container Helper is its own little world. It's not difficult, but when I first started working with it, it seemed like this cryptic thing in parameters and what do I need to know? And it's not hard, but when you're first looking at it, it's just like I had no idea how to use it. Now I think I kind of understand it to the point where I'm minimally dangerous, and I constantly run into things and don't understand it and have to learn it. It's like, oh, okay, now I understand it a little bit more. So now I think I'm fairly comfortable with at least being able to use it as an end user. And Now I'm able to know just enough about PowerShell where I'm able to automatically generate my BC containers and take care of that, so I'm not having to do that every day. Well, so now you have a development environment. You're ready to code. Well, now you need to install VS Code. And VS Code kind of looks fundamentally simple, but if you came from Visual Studio, if you came from Seaside or CAL or some other environment, it's a different IDE. And someone who's used VS Code is saying, oh, it's really simple. Well, yes, but everything is different. All the paradigms are different. Extensions and how it deals with solutions and projects and file-based code structures, and it's just different. I've used Visual Studio for years. VS Code is an entirely different animal, so I'm having to kind of wrap my brain around how it works. It behaves differently. Just the simplest navigation, I stare at it to try to find how do I do that one thing that I'm used to doing in Visual Studio. It's totally different in Visual Studio Code. I don't know. So, it's just getting familiar with it. VS Code extensions. There are a whole bunch of VS Code extensions for AL development. And you can just use the AL code language or AL language extension. That's great. But there are a bunch of helper extensions that are very commonly used. You kind of want to know how those work. And if you've seen some of the Twitter conversations, there are some extensions that throw out a bunch of different warnings or error message about how you're not doing something right. Well, some of those things are valid. Some of those things can be ignored. Some can be disabled. Well, I need to figure out how do I navigate all those messages and use those extensions properly. Well, then you can finally get to the actual AL language. And you have some syntax. You have variables. You have braces and brackets or semicolons or whatever that syntax looks like. You have keywords, reserved words. Then you have data structures. You have how do you do things. So I used to do things with a data table or a connection or this structure or this best practice in .NET. How do I do that in AL? It's all different. Entirely different world of the language. Well, there's more to that, which I'll get to. So let's say you understand the basics of the language. Well, that's one interface to BC. Using AL code to directly interact with the with the BC SaaS application. Well, then there's the APIs. That's an entirely different universe of accessing Business Central data and going through the back end to read, insert, update data. Okay, so it's really valuable to know that because maybe you don't have to develop something in AL. Maybe you just need a BC API integration for importing data, having a web service update, having a system integration, whatever. So that's what I need to deal with. So there's the Business Central Open API 3.0. It's a mouthful. I just call them the BC APIs. Not to be confused with the technically, I think, different OData APIs. So you may be familiar with the OData v4 APIs. My understanding is those are technically different. So those run under a different context under the hood in Business Central. Okay. Well, there are a whole bunch of OData v4 APIs, and those are used by things like Power BI. So if you want to get to the data, the Power BI OData APIs, really, there's some pre-built APIs that are really nice. So those are very handy to know about. And I don't know the status of those or if they're going to be deprecated or retired at some point. But my understanding is the official word from Microsoft is if you need to integrate via API, use the new BC APIs v1.0. Okay, so you're starting to develop. You've got your code. Well, there's this thing called Git. And my understanding is Seaside and BCAL or CAL that used a certain method for storing the code, saving the code, a different way of managing your code repository. Well, now with VS Code and AL, you use Git. Git is an entire universe of knowledge. It is a frustrating little animal. I've been using it for 5 years, something like that. And to this day, like I've been using 10% of it that I've needed to know to get my work done and do source control for me. All sorts of dimensions and how you use Git that it's a fair amount of knowledge. And even people who are experienced with Git can sometimes be frustrated with Git. So it requires patience. So there's an entire dimension to learn. So once you know Git and you can start checking in your code, there's this whole thing called Azure DevOps. Now you may have your own online repository for hosting your Git repositories. Maybe it's Bitbucket, maybe it's GitHub, maybe it's something else. But my understanding is there's some benefit to using Azure DevOps because that's more than just a Git repository where you check in your code and do source control. Azure DevOps has the entire product lifecycle or development lifecycle, the CI/CD pipeline, as it's called, continuous integration, continuous deployment. You have build pipelines, maybe you have Kanban boards, maybe you have project planning, issue management, really an entire new universe of more proper structured source code control or source code management, application development, enterprise grade product management features in Azure DevOps. And if you're looking to really do things properly, some Azure DevOps or something like it, whatever that equivalent product or service is, maybe Atlassian is something similar. I'm not sure, but Azure DevOps is in the Microsoft family, so maybe it makes sense to use that. That seems to be the popular choice in the Business Central world. So there's a whole dimension of learning. Great, so you figured out how to write some code, check it in with Git, use Azure DevOps to do your builds. Well, you'll want to look into automated testing. If you follow Luke on Twitter, Luke Van Voot, not sure how to say that. He is a big advocate of automated testing, and I took his class recently on automated testing for Business Central. Entire domain of knowledge. Just as you need to learn how to program, automated testing in Business Central is an entirely different chapter. It's like a different college degree just for automated testing in BL. You could be a great AL developer, but then you need to learn, okay, how do I do automated testing? There are test libraries. There's an entire structure for adding automated testing to your BCAL code projects. And then you have a test-first design philosophy. What? I thought I wrote code. No, you wrote tests first, and then you write code to fulfill your tests. Mind-bending, just wrapping my head around that is very different. I get it, but to actually do that in practice, I had to step back. It's like, okay. So I took the class. It was above my level at the time, so I need to revisit it. So I have all the class materials. I'm going to have to kind of self-retake that course. So now you've got your Git, you've got your Azure DevOps, you've got some automated testing in place. So now you're ready to build your pipeline. So set up some automation pipelines to build your Docker containers, have your PowerShell automation to get your containers ready, Nav Container Helper, build your AL code, use your Azure DevOps to automate that process, kick off your automated tests, and automate your entire process so that when those BC releases come out like every single day, if not twice a day, you can do automated testing against those new builds, and you can get notifications, hey, everything went great, perfect. Your solution, your AL extension is ready to go. Nothing broke on these new BC builds. Or, hey, build 15,000 just came out. These 7 things broke. You need to revisit this because there was a change in the AL language, and this method, this structure, this property, it's going to be deprecated. So you need to change your code to adopt this new best practice going forward. How do you deal with that, right? And of course, you can't just learn AL code. That's really naive I was naive to think I just learn AL, right? There is this entire domain of knowledge around BC architecture. So I've worked with Dynamics GP for so long, I understand the architecture. I understand the client server architecture. I understand the data models, the SQL tables, the store procedures, the APIs. I know how all those things work, all those moving pieces. I need to learn all that for BC. When I write some AL code, am I causing a mess over here? Am I doing something wrong here? Am I going to cause myself pain later down the road because of the way I implemented that AL code? It's hard to read that in a book. That's more design and architecture and how do you best structure your projects? How do you best write the code to do what you're trying to do? You may find a way, but it may not be the greatest way. So yesterday I talked about how I use PowerShell to do something, and I knew it was a hack. I just didn't know the better way to do it. I knew what I was doing was not ideal and it needed to be refactored, but I just didn't have the skill or knowledge as to how I should be doing it. So I need to understand more about BC architecture and AL architecture. And that's harder. My assessment is that's harder to do with BC SaaS. So the people who have been working with Nav and BC on-prem and understand that background of the historical implementations, they understand that architecture better. And even if there's a lot different with BC SaaS and AL, they still have some context. And my interpretation is that helps. So you've got all that going. You want to start to learn your BC and AL architecture. You think you're confident, you're like, I know this, and then there's a new release. BC changes, BC SaaS changes, AL changes, some new features, some new way of doing something in AL. Something gets deprecated. API goes from beta to 1.0 or 1.0 to 2.0. Or the ODatas get deprecated, you're relying on those. Or you're using table extensions this way, and due to performance reasons, that has been refactored and re-architected to use table extensions this way. So you're never done, right? There's always something that's changing. There's always a new release. There's always new features. There's always things get dropped. So you need to relearn something. Well, that's just the development side, right? And then there's the actual application. And I'm new to BC. I know GP pretty well. Now I need to relearn BC SaaS. And yes, I know how to enter a journal entry in GP. I literally need to figure out how do I do that properly in BC. Journal entries, sales orders, sales invoices, purchasing documents, receipts, inventory, AP payments, cash receipts, bank recs, cash management, not to mention reporting. There's module reporting, there's operational reports, there's financial reporting, entire domains of reporting, right? Job queues, automation, job cost, just the list goes on with all of the modules and functionality within the application. So that's Neo with the red pill, right? He thought his life was simple. Once he takes the pill, it's just like, whoa, he sees the matrix and things get kind of crazy. And it's like, okay, it takes time to digest all that. So that's kind of what I'm facing. And it's a little bit daunting. It's not a 3-month exercise. It's not a 6-month exercise. It's a 12 plus month multi-year exercise. And if I think about how long it took to understand and learn Dynamics GP and how to learn how to develop for it, that was my full-time job for several years. And I'm still learning stuff that I didn't know, or I forgot it and I'm relearning it. So, and that was a fairly stable, static product. At least it's been stable for many years and hasn't changed a lot. And I'm still learning. So it's a long process. So how do you go about learning, right? Where do you look? And there are tons of resources for Business Central, which is great. But there are also tons of resources for Business Central. So you're having to sift through them, sort them, find them, figure out how do you prioritize, how do you know what to learn. So I'd say figure out what's relevant for you. Are you a functional end user? Are you a functional consultant? Are you a developer? Well, I have a blog post that I've been maintaining. It has over 170 different links to resources. And some of those are more traditional resources, websites, training, documentation. And then there's the list of all the YouTube channels and Twitter users and blog posts. So just everything I've found, I just put it on there as the free learning resources where you might learn something and start participating. Well, there's free online training, right? There's tons of blogs. There are several YouTube channels that I've talked about. There are online conferences. Now that the world is figuring out how to put on online conferences, this is kind of the fall conference season, so there will be several online conferences with BC content. Some of those are free. I think some of those will be paid, so you can participate in those. There's paid instructor-led classes, and I totally empathize if you prefer that over trying to watch YouTube videos. I know I do. So I've attended the NAV BC training a couple years ago with Carrie Roswald and her company. I've attended Luke's automated testing class online. I've attended AJ Kaufman's BC API class, and I got a lot out of those, but I'm still very early in the process, so it's not like I was able to jump on those and use those right away. So I'll need to revisit all of those materials in order to relearn. So no shortage of resources. And there's also the forums, of course, and Twitter if you have questions. So no shortage of resources. So now if you look at those lists of resources, it's a bit overwhelming on its own, right? Where do you start? So I'm just trying to learn one thing at a time. Rather than trying to learn BC application and AL and development and all that stuff, I just started with, since I need to learn development, I started with Docker. It's like Docker and Nav Container Helper. Until I can figure out how to get my own development environment set up, it's hard for me to reliably do development. Where do I develop and what do I develop against? And so, package delivery. So I focused on Docker for several months, and it took me months because I started in 2018. It was a bit of a mess. And Docker had some quirks, Windows had some quirks, the versions prior to 1809 didn't work well. So I spent hours figuring that out, and it spent months now just getting comfortable with Docker. And the people who've installed Docker and it's run fine for them, they say, it's easy, what's the problem? But if you've run into problems with Docker and it's crashed, it hasn't worked, you've had all sorts of errors, you know what I'm talking about. Some people, they're like, it flawlessly, never had a problem. And you're like, well, good for you. I'm not one of those people. I ran into, it seems like, every single Docker problem imaginable. So I empathize. So now I'm to the point where I kind of think I understand how to get Docker to behave, how I be careful with how I work with it to make it work reliably. Then I got comfortable with Nav Container Helper, and I'm starting to automate that. In order to automate that, I had to learn PowerShell. So I spent Friday night this week learning PowerShell, like minimally learning just what I needed to know. I have learned BC APIs a little bit, and I'm slowly learning the BC SaaS application. And through all of this, I'm learning video and live streaming. So it's a journey. I wouldn't try to tackle everything at once. Just pick one thing and start there. Get comfortable with that learning process and move on. So learning still takes time. Unfortunately, we're not at the matrix level where we can jack into the matrix and have helicopter piloting experience downloaded to our brain. That would be awesome. I'd love it, but not quite there yet. So it's just time. It's just focus time. So spending the time, focusing, coming up with some routine. So for me, my new routine is work a little bit in the morning, work a little bit in the evening, work a little bit on the weekends. And I do these videos in order to force myself to spend a little bit of time every day or a couple of times a week coming up with a topic, learning it, and then presenting it. It's just self-imposed learning routine. Some people are fortunate in a sense that they can do this at work. Maybe your job is as a Business Central consultant where your employer helps with the training. You're around colleagues who work with to learn. You have customers where you're learning on the job. You're essentially getting paid to learn. That's pretty nice. I've been there. It's a luxury. I no longer have that luxury. So I have to do work for customers who pay, and that's an entirely different universe. All of my BC learning at the moment is on my free time. This is 100% mornings, evenings, and weekends. So it is my side job. And then, like me, there's the personal learning group, and it's tough. You just got to invest in it. So why do this? And if you don't love learning, this is going to be painful. I don't know how else to say it, but I happen to like learning. That's why I like consulting in the work that I do. It's constant learning. It never gets stale and old. So for me, going into a big concrete building, going to the same cube every day, sitting at the same computer and doing the same work, I've done it, and it was soul crushing for me because I was no longer learning. So I enjoy the learning. It is painful. I admit there are days I'm like, ugh, but I just do it kind of like, flossing and brushing and working out and eating right and just stuff you gotta do every day. Once you get in the routine, it's like, okay, it's just what I have to do. It can be frustrating at first, but once you learn something, it's like, it's pretty rewarding. It's like, you feel good about it. And what I like most is when you have something where you know nothing and it's pretty complex to learn and you really have to work at it. And you get to this point, it's happened to me several times, where you kind of have this epiphany moment. You're like, it just suddenly starts to make sense. So Neo, when he figures out the matrix, he's like, whoa, I can see the matrix. It goes from the green numbers going down the screen to he sees the hallways, he sees the agents, he can make the walls bow and he can make bullets stop. It's like, whoa, you suddenly realize all the little bits that have been shoved into your brain, it all comes together and coalesces and gels, and you can kind of navigate this entirely new world. It's pretty cool. So when I first learned programming languages or databases, or I had to learn ASP, the classic old original ASP 1.0, I had 2 weekends to learn it from scratch. I had no idea what I was doing for a big project. And it was like, after I learned it, it's like, whoa, it was pretty magical. And I had to relearn ASP.NET Core. Painful process. But once I got done after a couple weekends, it's like, wow, this is really powerful. And now you can just look at it and you see the code. You glance at the code and you understand what it's doing. The architecture is kind of spinning in the back of your brain as to how these pieces work together. So that's that epiphany moment that is really rewarding and pretty cool. And you kind of feel proud about that learning and try to be modest about it. But anyway, that's why I love learning. So painful process. I'm just on a journey. I'm just making these videos and blog posts to share what I'm learning. And I hope you're able to learn and enjoy this process and journey as well. So have a good morning, and I will see you later.
Good morning, life. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and in love.